Hello everyone and welcome back to Hanging Pawns. The Candidates Tournament is well underway and round 3 brought a great deal of excitement but not that many decisive results unfortunately. This game was played between Wesley So and Ding Liren. Wesley has definitely had a terrible start to the tournament, losing both games in first 2 rounds to Fabiano Caruana and then to Alexander Grishchuk. In this game he was white and he opened with 1e4, and I can imagine how he must have felt before the start of the game. I mean, losing the first 2 rounds in the most important tournament in a cycle of a few years, and perhaps one of the last chances for him to become the challenger for the world champion. Anyway, he opened with e4, we have e5 by Ding Liren, knight to f3, knight to c6, and bishop to b5, the Ruy Lopez or the Spanish game. a6, bishop a4, the main moves, knight to f6, castles, bishop to e7, rook e1, normal developing moves from both players so far, and the position is still completely equal and highly theoretical. b5 by black, chasing the bishop away to b3, black castles, and c3 in this position. And now Ding Liren decides to play d5, he goes for the Marshall attack. A line often played by Levin Aronian and Michael Adams and many other strong GMs. And the Marshall is one of the most powerful weapons against the Ruy Lopez, and players with white will often avoid it by playing h3 instead of c3 on move 8. And the point of c3 is that white is trying to prepare d4, and the Marshall attack, a swift d5 for black, is aiming to disrupt that. The weaknesses that black is trying to exploit is the fact that white has slowed down his development by playing the move c3, and thus taken away an important square for the knight still stuck on b1, so white has a significant difficulty developing after d5. Here Wesley responds with e takes d5, which is the only and the main move, and the variation that occurs 99% of the time leads to knight takes d5, knight takes e5, grabbing a central pawn, knight takes e5, and rook takes e5. A position in which Wesley So grabbed the central pawn, and he is now a pawn up, but if you look at his pieces, the entire queen side is still completely undeveloped, and black has clear compensation for the material after c6. This is now considered to be the starting position of the Marshall attack. And Wesley continues with rook e1, which is the second most popular move after d4, which could also be played, but black plays bishop to d6, and if white had played d4 instead of rook to e1, he would have played rook to e1 now, because the bishop would attack the rook. The point is that it's clear that Ding Liren's pieces stand perfectly aimed at white's king, and Wesley is, as all players playing against the Marshall attack, trying to wriggle out of the position and develop his pieces. So the idea of the opening is to stop white from developing in a normal fashion, give up a pawn, but often players with black will regain it eventually, because there is no way white can stand the pressure without giving back some material. We have d3 by Wesley, opening up the bishop, bishop f5, activating the light squared bishop on the most active square, queen to f3, and queen h4, not giving Wesley So time to take the bishop on f5, because he could take on h2 with check, and it's not checkmate because the king has the f1 square, but it leads to a mega complex line which is very dangerous for white, and which Wesley must have wanted to avoid, considering he lost the first 2 rounds of the tournament and he probably didn't want to risk anything. If he had taken the bishop, the line would have gone like this, so queen takes f5, the queen would take on h2 with check, king has only one square, f1, queen h1 check, king e2, and now rook a2 e8 check. And in this position he has to play bishop to e3, and the line would go knight takes c3, rook takes h1, grabbing the queen, knight takes the queen with check, and king to f3. And the position is equal, white is perhaps even a bit better, but there is no way a human could have calculated all the variations here. This is just one line I've shown you. And after queen h1 check, king e2, rook a8, if white plays king to d2, then of course the rook is hanging, so queen to e1 check, and the mate is soon to follow. So after queen h4, in this position, Wesley smartly didn't take the bishop on f5, even though eventually it would have led to a slightly better position for white, but not risking anything, he played g3. just forcing the queen away, and Ding Liren keeps the queen around the white king with queen to h3. And Wesley gives back a pawn, but plays the best move in the position, realizing that material in exchange for development is a bad deal in this position. He plays bishop to e3, and Ding Liren grabs a pawn and regains a pawn with bishop takes d3. And now Wesley finally gets to develop his queen side. He plays knight to d2, we have queen to f5, challenging the white queen on f3, bishop to d4, aiming some of his pieces at Ding Liren's king finally, and the position has changed drastically because of Wesley's smart decision to sack the d-pawn. He managed to bring all his pieces to life, and he now stands even a bit better. Most often in the martial attack, players with white will have to give back the pawn or suffer, so this is not such an uncommon turn of events in the variation. Ding Liren continues with rook f to d8, and I must say I think this is the case of the wrong rook. He should have developed the a rook to the d file to leave a useful square for the f rook on e8, and this way his a rook has no really good squares to develop to. Perhaps he is counting on a queenside pawn advance, but I believe the rook is more needed in the center at the moment. Wesley plays a4, smartly preventing an early pawn push by black. We have h6 by Ding Liren, making some luft and perhaps giving a retreat square for the bishop as well. h4, Wesley expands on both sides of the board. Rook a to c8, preparing to play c5. Wesley plays a takes b5, we have a takes b5, and now bishop takes d5. He decides to give up the bishop pair, which is definitely a good decision in this position, since the knight on d5 was controlling 4 key squares in the position and blocking the light square bishop anyway, so it was much better than the bishop. And we have c takes, of course taking with the pawn, not with the queen, because he wants to open up the rook and keep the queen around the king. We have queen to f5 now by Wesley, and bishop takes f5. A sort of disappointing decision, but I think he shouldn't have traded the queens, because that definitely decreases the chance for a decisive result and already makes the game look drawing. But he does stand a tiny bit better, so perhaps it is justified. But in his position in the tournament, with 2 losses, I think he should have had more courage and just kept the queens on and went on the attack, and if there was no other options, traded the queens then, but anyway, it's his decision. He has a great bishop on d4 and a better pawn structure, while Ding Liren has 2 isolated pawns, and he also has, but Ding Liren also has the bishop pair though, so the position is even, and the presence of the queens would have made it more fun, definitely. We have rook to a5 by Wesley, targeting the weak b pawn, but the d pawn as well, indirectly, and Ding Liren responds with the best move in the position, which I don't think many people would consider, at least not many people who aren't grandmasters. He doesn't just defend the pawn with rook to b8, he pushes b4, sacrificing a pawn, and Wesley So takes with rook takes d5. We have bishop to e6, attacking the rook, it retreats to a5, b takes c3, bishop takes c3, and rook to b8. And Ding Liren made a wise decision to give up the pawn, because white is just a little better, and it's not really enough to win, and if he had passively defended by retreating the rook, Wesley would have had a strong initiative worth much more than the b pawn. And the rook would be stuck behind the b pawn, and just he wouldn't have anything in the position. The game continues with knight to f1 by Wesley So, remaneuvering the knight to e3, and now bishop to b4, rook a to a1, retreating, bishop to c5, knight to e3, not letting the bishop target the weak f7 square, rook to d3, rook e to d1, challenging the rook, Ding Liren doubles, and the rooks get exchanged, rook to d1, and he just has to take now, knight takes, bishop to b3, knight to e3, and bishop takes, f takes, and in this position king to f8 was played by Ding Liren, king to f2, and the players agreed a draw. It is an opposite, it's an opposite colored bishop sending, which is almost impossible to lose for black, despite him being a pawn down, so it's justified, because once the kingside pawns get exchanged, which is inevitable because the structure is almost symmetrical, the bishop can just sacrifice itself for the last remaining pawn, and the opponent's bishop can't do anything about that. And I mean, it's not always that opposite colored bishops endings are drawn, but very often it is the case, and this position is a perfect example of how an extra pawn, even though it's a passed pawn, on the opposite side of the board doesn't mean almost anything. So yeah, they called it a day, and yeah, it's okay, it was a draw. With this game, Wesley So has finally managed to stop the bleeding, and a draw is an okay result for him going into the break day and round 4, in which he faces Mamediaro, which is a formidable opponent, especially with his play on the tournament. He's highly aggressive and he will probably push for a win. Even though I think Wesley will have the black pieces, yeah. He has to get back on his feet now and try to play with a clear head on Wednesday, and this result isn't great for him, but I think a loss would have crushed him completely, so I'm sort of happy that he got a draw at least. Yeah, so let's hope he can do better on Wednesday. Okay everyone, thanks for watching, I hope you got to learn something about the martial attack, and see you soon for more analysis from the Candidates Tournament. Cheers, bye!